Hello marine biology students. In this video we're going to talk about marine sediments and continental margins. So marine sediments are materials that accumulate on the bottom of the sea floor. Sediments are composed of small fine material that settles on the sea floor. The composition of the sediments and the accumulation of the settlements will vary for various regions of the seafloor of an ocean basin. The rates of accumulation and really the length of time that ocean basin has been around will all factor into the quantity and again the type of sediments that are there. The amount of sediments can be an indication of the age of an ocean basin. Sediments can also provide information about the water column above that specific section of the sea floor, and also provide insights about local geographical features. There are two primary sources for marine sediments. There are those that come from the weathering down of rocks, usually from the continents. We call these lithogenous sediments. But there can also be sediments that are formed by organisms. We call these biogenous sediments. So lithogenous and biogenous sediments, these make up the sediment that accumulates on the sea floor. Now, biogenous sediments usually are going to be composed of microfossils. Whether we're talking about the shells of foraminiferans or maybe the little plates from coccolithophores. In fact, chalk is a deposit of these little calcareous discs from microorganisms known as coccolithophores. The age of the sediments themselves can be determined using carbon dating and other types of isotope testing. In fact, for some of these microorganisms, like the foraminiferans, the way their shell forms is actually an indication of the ocean temperatures that those organisms lived in. And so ocean temperature at the time that those microfossils were deposited can also be determined. In graduate school, I had a friend who was a paleoclimatologist, where he would look at ocean sediments and be able to determine information about weather and climate in the distant geological past. So here we see what some of these shells look like. These are the tests of foraminiferans, and again through isotope testing, whether it's carbon dating or even oxygen isotope testing to determine temperature. These types of microfossils can provide a good deal of information about what the oceans used to be like in the past. The rest of this video, I'd like to spend some time talking about continental margins. So this is really where the continents are meeting the oceans. So the margins of continents are boundaries between continental crust and oceanic crust. You can really think of these as being the sides or edges of the continent. These edges of the continent, these continental margins, generally consist of a continental shelf, the continental slope, and the continental rise. So looking at a diagram of these continental margins, we can see the continental shelf and then a shelf break that transitions to the Continental Slope, and then the Continental Rise down at the bottom of the Continental Slope as an interface between the ocean floor and abyssal plain and this continental margin. So let's talk about these different sections of the continental margin. So the continental shelf, this is actually composed of continental crust, not oceanic crust. And this continental crust is actually below sea level. So in this part of the ocean, the seafloor is chemically very similar in composition to the rocks and the land that are on the shore above. Continental shelf ends up making up about 8% of the ocean's surface. Yet, it is one of the richest areas of the ocean in terms of the number of species. The biodiversity of this region is significantly higher than a lot of other places in the ocean, such as the open ocean. The width of the continental shelf varies depending on which shoreline you're looking at, anywhere from as small as 1 kilometer up to 750 kilometers. Now, the end of the continental shelf is a region known as the shelf break. And this shelf break typically happens at a depth of around 120 to 400 meters. After that shelf break, the edge of the continent, this continental margin, is known as the Continental Slope. And again, this Continental Slope really can be thought of as the edge or side of the continent. It begins at the shelf break and extends down to the deep sea floor. Its descent is at a much steeper angle than the continental shelf and Continental Rise. The Continental Rise is formed by sediments that had been pushed down from the continental shelf and slope. So these are sediments that are either entering the ocean from rivers or streams or erosion of the continental crust above. They enter the sediment, and as they travel down the continental slope, they accumulate at the bottom, and this is known as the Continental Rise. It can almost be thought of as an underwater river delta. Or an alluvial fan, but in this case the river is formed by the sediments. Now, if you have an active margin, the Continental Rise may be absent. And in its place, you might have an oceanic trench. And so with that, let's talk a bit about the different types of continental margins. In a passive margin, the edge of the continental plate is not directly against an oceanic plate, but you have both oceanic crust and continental crust as a part of the same lithospheric plate. Passive margins are relatively inactive, geologically speaking. There's going to be a wide, flat coastal plain, wide continental shelf, and the continental slope will be at a gentler angle than on an active margin. And examples of this would be on the east coast of the United States and also on the coast of Brazil. Here you have a wide continental shelf, gentle continental slope, and you would have a significant continental rise at the bottom of those continental slopes. Conversely, in an active margin, these are sites of more intense geologic activity, including earthquakes and volcanoes and trenches. Active margins typically are categorized by steep, rocky shorelines, narrow continental shelves, and very steep continental slopes. Sometimes the Continental Rise may be totally absent and replaced instead with an ocean trench. The west coast of the United States and the coast of Chile are examples of this. So when we look at the difference here between the east coast and the west coast of the American continents, on the west coast we have a separate oceanic plate that is coming up against the continental plate, and this is a subduction zone. The oceanic plate, being more dense, is going beneath the continental plate, but this is going to result in mountains and volcanoes and earthquakes and geologic activity. We also see a very short continental shelf, a very steep angle on the Continental Slope, and down at the bottom of the Continental Slope, little or no Continental Rise at all. And that's because the sediments, as they're coming down, they are also being subducted into that trench. Whereas if we look on the Atlantic coast of the American continents, here the Atlantic Ocean is on the same lithospheric plate as the continent itself. There's a wide continental shelf, a gentle sloping to the continental slope, and a significant continental rise. All of these are indications of a passive margin. That brings us to the end of this video. Now, one thing I would like you to consider before our next video is, how would life be different if you were surrounded by water instead of being surrounded by air like we are on land? All right, see you in the next video.